Item 9, Aisha, come on up. This item, Controller Betty Yee sent a letter to the committee on the issue of executive compensation. No, Lynn, did you want to make any opening comments on this item as it came from Betty's office, or do you want to wait for Aisha's presentation? Sure, let me get you clicked in here. Lynn, and then we'll turn it over to you, Aisha.
Good.
Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you. We really do appreciate the fact that the Investment Committee Chair and staff acted so quickly to bring this matter to the board discussion. We've been very curious to see how the executive pay ratio could be used in our engagement efforts. And I think that there was a lot of press back in the second quarter when this was first starting to be announced. And some of the ratios, at least at first glance, look very egregious. And I know that there's a lot of different factors to go into that. But so we appreciate the ability to have the discussion today and to see what we project is coming forward and how we can best use that. Thank you.
Okay, Aisha.
So, Aisha Mastagni, Portfolio Manager in Corporate Governance, and we're here to talk about executive compensation, everyone's favorite subject, or at least mine. We're going to specifically focus on the CEO pay ratio. I want to give a call out first to Douglas Chen, who works in the Corporate Governance Investment Office. He really helped put a lot of this data together. And also one of our student interns that you all met back in July, Jonathan Baglos. He gathered a lot of this data. And I think it's just nice for them to see sort of a project from beginning to end. And although he's not here, maybe he has nothing else to do and is watching us online. So I have a quick agenda, and I'm basically just going to go over at a very high level, talk about the staff's current process for evaluating pay. Then I'm going to walk through the specifics of the pay ratio because there are some nuances that I think sometimes the press doesn't pick up on. And then I have a couple of examples, and then definitely talk about next steps for how we plan to use it in the future. So our current process is outlined by the corporate governance principles, which are board approved. We have a whole section within those corporate governance principles that are basically laid out under the bullet points on the slide here. So first and foremost, we're looking for companies to articulate what their pay philosophy is. And this is sort of where that pay for performance comes into play and alignment with management and shareholders. Under plan elements and incentive metrics, this is where we're looking for what's the balance between salary or sort of guaranteed pay and pay that is at risk. We also dive into how robust the incentive metrics are, what are the metrics that they're using, how robust are they, and do they align with long-term value creation. The compensation structure, this is what I like to call sort of the governance of executive pay. So certain structural elements like, do they have a clawback policy? Do they have hedging and pledging policies? What are their peer benchmarking? What does that look like? And then last but not least, we're looking for accountability. You know, the compensation committee should oversee the compensation plan. They should help design it. And they should ultimately be driving the process because there are representatives inside the boardroom. So the pay ratio, I think you all know, was established through Dodd-Frank. That was in 2010. It took the SEC several years to come up with what an agreed upon methodology. So 2018 was the first year that companies actually began disclosing their pay ratio. And I bolded the median employee pay because I think that's a very important point. It's not the average, it's the median employee. The ratio itself allows for quite a bit of flexibility for determining that median pay. Put a few bullet points up there. That emphasis that I said on the median pay, that's really important because if you look at larger companies, and I have a few statistics later in the presentation, you know, you have a lot of employees sort of at an hourly pay base or at a lower pay base. And as you get higher and higher in the organization, people are paid more, but there's also fewer employees. So that affects that median number. Another piece is it's important that There's some flexibility about whether you annualize or don't annualize a employee's pay. Some companies choose to and others do not. So that significantly affects the ratio. So company factors obviously have a significant effect on the ratio. This is company size by market capitalization. As you can see, like CEO pay as companies get larger, it's significantly correlated with higher CEO pay. And so you see that effect here. The larger the company, the bigger the CEO pay ratio. This is just another way of looking at size of a company. So the chart on the left is actually the median employee salary based on the number of employees. So what I think is kind of interesting here is there's actually not a whole lot of variability, excluding sort of the less than 1,000 employees. I mean, the salary there is about, $50,000 a year. But what's interesting is, as if you look at the chart on the right, the more and more employees you have, the higher and higher the CEO pay ratio gets. This is the pay ratio by sector. And so you can see, once again, the chart on the left, there is quite a bit of variability in terms of the median pay ratio by sector. But if you compare that to the chart on the right, well, you can see it sort of trends down as you look at the sectors. It's really a range of about $11 to $15 million a year. So not a whole lot of variability. And part of the reason I bring this up is so what it really is, it's the denominator of that pay ratio that really affects this ratio, not so much the numerator. I mean, in some cases, there's definitely some egregious examples, but it's really, what does that median employee number look like? So here's a couple of our examples. So this is Mattel, and at the time this came out, this pay ratio at almost 5,000 to 1 was the highest number in the S&P 500. There was a lot of eye-popping sort of headlines about this. Their median employee, as you can see, only made $6,000 a year. Most of their employees are seasonal. I think 70% of their employees are overseas, so that also affects the ratio. There are some companies, because of that de minimis exception by the SEC, can exclude overseas employees. Obviously, 70% is not de minimis in Mattel's case. It's 78%, there you go. And this one, just so that the board knows, it wasn't just the CEO pay ratio why we voted against this pay package. There were a lot of other very egregious practices, and the way that a lot of her sign-on bonuses were given. There were some guaranteed payments when she came on board. They weren't linked to long-term value creation. They gave retention bonuses to other executive officers, and just an overall lack of pay for performance, which really drove our against vote here at Mattel. So this is an example where we actually did vote for the say on pay at the company. McDonald's, obviously, that pay ratio was an eye-popping number. But I think this is where some of those nuances come into play. So as you can see, the main driver for this is the median employee compensation at $7,000. So McDonald's is a company that chose not to annualize their median employee number. They identified their median employee as a part-time restaurant worker in Poland. And I'm sorry, what was that? They identified the median employee as a part-time restaurant worker in Poland.
It's an actual person.
An actual person. That's who it was.
That's who it was.
Yep. And the other thing that's interesting about Mr. Easterbrook's compensation, so his CEO pay, is it actually includes this long-term cash incentive. So this was a cash incentive that was earned over 3 years prior. So it was, I want to say it was awarded. It was granted in 2015, but there were certain metrics that he had to achieve in order to get a payout in 2017. So it's a long-term award, which we like to see. And you could see by the company's very strong performance in 2017, I mean, he did earn that award, and there was a strong sense of pay-for-performance alignment here. And then last but not least, I just want the board to know, obviously, we're looking at these pay ratios. They're one part of a very complicated process of evaluating executive compensation. We're definitely going to monitor sort of outlier pay ratios, but as you can see, you really have to dig into the details to understand what's driving that. And we also think that the pay ratios might be even more meaningful over time. So do we see that pay ratio adjusting because they're moving more employees overseas, or they have more contractors? It's things like that that we have to try to understand. We're also talking to the proxy advisors to try to understand. They gather a lot of data for us, and how are they incorporating this into their analysis? Right now, for a lot of them, it's one data point. We're trying to understand, okay, so should it be, if you're 2 standard deviations away from the average? I mean, I don't know what that point is, which would sort of be a flag for us, but these are all the things we're sort of taking under advisement at the moment. So that is all I have. I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Aisha. We have a few people in the queue. First one says to me, it's seat number 2. I don't know who is in seat number 2, but it tells me seat 2. Is that you, Lynn? Okay. Go for it, Lynn. Go ahead. Okay, so it's not you. We're going to come back to you. All right, because you appear on my screen.
It says
It might,
no.
okay. So we're going to go right to you, Dana, and then you're next, Lynn.
Okay.
Dana?
All righty. Aisha, you said a couple things that I wasn't quite sure, and then there were some slides that were kind of shocking. So you talked about sometimes corporations or companies decide to annualize the pay or not annualize the pay. Can you explain what you mean by that to me, please?
So for example, with McDonald's, companies can choose, say a person didn't work the entire fiscal year. Some companies can choose to annualize that number so it basically would look larger, like they worked the entire year. Other companies do not.
So when you're talking about annualized pay, then it's what a person would be paid over a span of a year, regardless if they worked the year or not.
Correct, correct, sorry.
All right. So that's like a term of art, I guess. So it's not like they're trying to spread a year's pay over multiple years.
No.
Okay.
It's basically because a lot of the companies, and especially in the consumer sector space, people come and go. They don't necessarily work their an entire year. Might be a part-time job, summer job.
Right, and they would just say what that yearly pay would have been if they'd been there a year, instead of telling you what they actually made.
Exactly, but a lot of the companies I look like chose not to annualize it. McDonald's was one of them. They did not annualize it.
All right. And then, let's go back to the slide. I'm not sure which one it was, but it had, the median salary, I think it's one before this. Yeah, median employee salary so then, for companies with less than 1,000, the median salary was 91,000?
Think of the tech companies.
Well, that's, I'm
Small
thinking,
tech companies.
that
This is
doesn't
the
work for
Russell-
Weed Elementary School.
Yeah. Well, this is the Russell 3000.
Got it.
So
Okay, I missed that reference, so that probably makes
sorry,
a
I
difference.
probably didn't mention that.
Alrighty, and then go ahead and go to the next slide. And I don't know, maybe Joy is the one to answer this. How is it that, we talk about the big numbers in financial institutions. And you're looking at the median CEO pay, which looks pretty reasonable compared to some of the others. And then even off to the right, the total comp is pretty reasonable. So I don't know if Joy wants to answer the question or not, or if you have the answer. How does somebody in healthcare have one of the lowest median pay ratios, but the very highest total comp? What is it? I mean,
It's because that median employee, they make more in the healthcare sector as opposed to the consumer goods or services sector.
They probably have more doctors on the payroll.
Exactly.
They have more people, employees in the medium, high pay range that brings the bottom up.
Yes.
The average rises up.
It's that denominator that's increasing as opposed to the numerator.
the numerator, got it.
All those doctors
Yeah.
working, all those PhDs working for Eli Lilly versus all those people working at McDonald's.
Got it, got it. That helps, thank you, because that was pretty shocking. Got it, thank you. It just means a lot of people in the financial they're all making a lot of money
Yes.
Across the board.
across the board.
Well, and you have to think about too, like in technology, there's a lot of engineers, there's a lot of, highly educated workforce as opposed to a
Same
part-time
for the utility.
hourly employee.
All right, thank you.
Lynn?
Thank you, Harry. I just want to say again, so on the behalf of the controller, we really do appreciate you putting all this effort into the discussion on this. And it's been such an important issue, and as we've seen, there's more and more anger against some of these outrageous CEO pay packages that are out there. So I'm curious, as you were going through your engagements this proxy season, was this topic one that was raised about trying to come up with a more uniform way to measure what the median salary was to make this a little bit more useful?
I think most companies appreciated the flexibility that the SEC afforded them when they came up with their methodology. So I think a lot of companies like the flexibility, and you'll even see in some disclosures, they'll offer an alternative ratio based on what they think is more comparable or makes more sense for their company. I think everyone's still absorbing the information.
Do you think we'll get to a place though whereby industry or sector within a certain industry that there'll be more coalitions against one specific way to measure it?
I think you will. I think it's the same way sort of measuring total compensation for the CEO. You've seen what people count and what they don't count and how they measure it, but there's still a lot of variability because it all depends on the metrics and, when things are paid out. And, a lot of times I see companies that they look good for a while in a rising market, but there's some structural issues. And so the pay is so complicated. It's not just one data point. So we have to look at everything in totality.
And my last question is, in looking, CalPERS made a change in how they looked at the total comp package for executives this year, not just this one data point. And so this year, they ended up voting against 43% of the executive pay packages. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on looking at that model as well and how that would possibly weigh in for next proxy year.
So I'm gonna actually have a conversation with some of the staff over at CalPERS because I was very interested when I saw that article as well. Just so the board knows, we're about 20%. I think we voted against around 21% of compensation plans and voted against about 18% of the say on pay votes. For us, our philosophy has always been to vote against those plans or say on pays where we feel are the most egregious. And those are the companies also that we choose to engage or we write letters to explain sort of what we don't like about their pay package. I think it would also be very hard, and that's why I'm curious to talk to PERS, to engage with that many companies to sort of drive real change. I like sort of focusing on those most egregious because comp is one of those things. I mean, it comes right out of the expense. It comes right out of the shareholder coffers. So we need to make sure we're getting our money's worth.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Sharon?
I'm just thinking about our compensation.
Sharon?
This, Sharon. The Yeah, compensation is tricky. Compensation committee, we have lots of robust conversations about compensation within our own organization. I was curious, I think it's so important that we discuss this, and I'm really appreciative, Betty, bringing it up, and that we continue to engage on this issue. And I just wondered on the other end, I think that slide on McDonald's is really interesting to me, and I think about workers. And how much do we engage? The numbers are staggering with CEOs, but on the flip side of the kind of the lowest paid workers, how much do we advocate for fair pay for workers on the low end of things? Because we all know kind of people who are valued with good pay tend to produce better in an organization. And so we have so much attention on the top, and I wonder how much attention do we at CalSTRS engage on the flip end? And a related question is how much of the bit economy and sort of the part-time workforce that we see happening globally, how much does that impact some of these numbers?
So a couple of things. When we talk to companies, I think what you're sort of getting at a little bit is that philosophy and what their policy is for compensation across the organization. We do have those discussions. Ultimately, for shareholders and investors, we're really only voting on the CEO's pay. But even before the pay ratio came out, when I had dialogue with companies, I said, the board, you should know or have a good idea what that ratio is. I mean, we're in a society where this pay inequality is becoming more and more apparent. And so I think it's important for them to understand what that ratio is and what their overall philosophy is in terms of pay across the organization. But we look to the compensation committee to really drive that philosophy, and we give input, but ultimately they're the ones that need to be accountable to shareholders and to be overseeing management.
Like bank tellers versus, Jamie Dimon. I mean, that's a perfect example to me of the disparity. And then just what about the...
Yeah, Wells Fargo is a good example where that culture sort of broke down. Mm-hmm.
For sure. And then what about the part-time workforce or kind of the... And then it just seems like kind of, I think of Microsoft or so many companies now hire people for, 6-month stints and how much does that affect some of these numbers in terms of calculating median?
Well, I definitely think it affects it, like I said, but it all depends on what that calculation is. We spend most of our time focusing on the CEO and the named executive officers. I mean, that's just been our focus from a shareholder standpoint.
Thanks, Aisha.
Karen?
Thank you, Aisha. Can you go back to the Mattel slide? I was curious about that slide because you said that CalSTRS voted against that proposal.
Yes.
So what does that look like? What happens next, or what happens to that whole proposal if we're one of the shareholders that votes against it? What happens to that overall proposal in the end? And then what do we as CalSTRS do to make sure that we still want to be against that issue?
Sure. So the say on pay vote, which is what we voted against, is an annual vote at most companies. So this will be up for vote again next year. In some cases, the other investor shareholders agree with us, and it may get to a majority where a majority of the investors have voted against that. And obviously, that's where you start to see real change. In this case, the CEO left shortly after. She's now the CEO of Ancestry.com. So it became somewhat of a moot point. But one of the things that we really didn't like about these sign-on bonuses was that while the company was able to recoup some of that, they weren't able to recoup all of it when she left. And that's what's so important when we see these sign-on bonuses, to ensure that they're linked to very specific value creation at the company, and also that they're still there to collect.
Okay. Thank you.
Mary, can I just ask a couple follow-up questions?
What's that?
May I ask a couple of follow-up questions that you should just to follow up on?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So I'll just ask my two questions and you can. So did she leave as a result? Was there any evidence that she left because of the vote on her compensation? That would be the first question. And then the second question is, which is sort of interesting, but probably needs to be made is, if you get this trend at a company like Mattel, which is in your portfolios, and you see this trend against, overwriting, do you divest of the company? What do you do with the company? Does the company still stay in your portfolio?
So no, this may have been a contributing factor, but Mattel has a whole lot of other issues and problems. I would say though, compensation's one of the areas where I have lots of examples where we've actually been able to make lasting change. And when you start to see companies, especially if they lose their say on pay vote, CEOs care. They care about, pay. So they're willing to engage and, across the board, this is where we've seen companies, they've added more robust clawback policies where they're stopping the hedging and pledging. We've been able to make the incentive metrics more closely aligned with shareholder value. So we don't divest, but it's an area where engagement really works.
I want to thank the controller for bringing this item to us. Just a couple of thoughts. As you said, Aisha, what we do, what the staff does is driven by what's in our corporate governance policy around executive compensation. And I want to express to the controller that I'm willing to work with her in any way possible to improve upon what we're doing. Generally speaking, what we have seen in executive compensation is quite extraordinary. And I wonder whether or not in your interactions, do people ever talk about the role that compensation consultants may have, what role they may play in driving up executive compensation?
We do talk about that a lot. I engage with a lot of various compensation consultants on this issue because I think they definitely play a role. Lot of conversations that we have with companies when we're having a meeting or a conference call, I can tell who's driving the show. If it's the consultants that's doing the majority of the talking and not the board members, that's seriously concerning for us. And so then obviously we're taking a deeper dive into the structure of that compensation. Who are their peers? Because that's a place where I think the compensation consultants could do a much better job is trying to help with that peer and not just trying to get to the median all the time. Not everyone's, average or median.
In your work, have you ever heard someone say, I'm paid enough? Does that exist?
I am. All the millions.
No, I mean that seriously. Maybe I'm a dreamer, but does anyone ever say, I have enough?
There's a few CEOs that are paid $1 a year because they feel like they either have so much invested already in the company itself or for a number of other reasons. So there are a few out there.
Maybe one or two other questions. Because I really want it to be around what we've been doing, driven by our policy, and what we might decide to do differently going forward. And I don't know if there's anything else we can do differently in terms of collaborating, who we're collaborating with. One of the areas that I've always kind of I think about some companies. I think about, the company that went over $1 trillion, the first company that went over $1 trillion. Now, if someone invested $1,000 in that company 10 years ago, say a school teacher invested $1,000 in that company. You think about the value creation that has been created by that company. And then you compare that to, let's say a former Fortune 500 company that's no longer in the index. It's been, I think they're about $12, and the wealth destruction. And you think about how those compensations, they're so different, right? Have we ever thought about holding up the executives that are actually reflecting the aspirational compensation philosophy that we believe in and saying, you're doing a great job.
That's difficult because the average CEO tenure now, I think, is down to like 5 years. So it's very, very short time period and things change so quickly. I'd be afraid of holding up the superstar and something else would happen. But you did hit on a key point, which is one that we drive home with a lot of companies, is I see that pay for performance. It should look like a straight line that goes, between your pay and your performance. But for the most part, a lot of companies sort of develop this floor so that it kind of goes like this. So there's a lot of upside and not a whole lot of downside. And so when we're talking to companies, so the company that sort of falls out of the S&P 500 or is destroying value, we want to make sure that it's aligned as much on the downside as it is on the upside.
And one last question. Are there any examples of companies out there that compensation committees actually have a philosophy that when the company does well and there are company goals that are, not only short-term but medium and long-term, that there's then benefits shared with everyone within the organization, from the person at the bottom of the rank to the top of the rank?
I think you saw some of that when there was some of the tax reform. A lot of companies, when they got that back, they were distributing it to the entire workforce. I'd have to go back and look at, some of those.
Maybe other parts of the world that actually look at it that way, and then, whether you can demonstrate that there's greater buy-in, more loyalty to the company, less turnover, more job satisfaction, because there is maybe there is a place where there's just too much, and maybe there's a lot of people who just don't have enough.
Yeah.
Right? Too few have too much, and too many have too little.
Yeah.
And I don't know what we can do from our perspective, but we do have a voice. We do believe in engagement. We do believe in collaborating. We do have a philosophy. And we should continue to exert that and maybe fine-tune what we have in our policy that truly reflects what we believe going forward. Because I don't think we, from my perspective, necessarily should do what we've been doing for the last 10 years around this issue going into the next 10 years.
Yeah. We just have to be sort of very mindful of, back in the early, 2000s, you saw a lot of companies that were distributing stock options to all their employees. Well, does that really drive better performance? I don't know. So, we have conversations, I can assure you, with companies about what their pay philosophy is and how they think they can drive employees. And it also leads into some of the other initiatives we have around human capital management, so employee engagement, making sure that folks are truly, tied to the company, not just through compensation, but through really wanting to work there.
We look forward to the continued conversation and work, and thanks to you and the team for the work that you've done so far, and thanks to the controller for bringing this item. Okay, thanks. If it's okay with the committee, we could break for lunch, if that's all right. And we'll come back at, 12:25? What about 45 minutes? Is that okay? All right, so that brings us back at 1:10. Thank you.